Hello and welcome to Tremaine Sci-Fi. Today we are interviewing Rebecca Fincher. She is an author and a contributor to Dungeons and Dragons. So, Rebecca, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Just a quick little rundown.
Yeah. So I'm a fantasy author and I write modules and different supplements for Dungeons and Dragons, as you'd already said. I've loved stories since I was little. I was reading at 4.5, but surprisingly couldn't really spell very well until after high school.
Ooh,
Um, uh, but I've loved stories for as long as I can remember. Would make up stories. I made up plays with my cousins growing up, and now I also do sword fighting and LARPing and all sorts of
nerdy
fun stuff.
things.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, I suppose we'll start off with childhood. So uh, you mentioned loving stories and things like that. So what kind of fiction did you read as a child? You started off quite young, so what kind of fiction like was it? You know, lots of people say Lord of the Rings or things like that. So what was your like first major novels?
The first ones that really Harry Potter was one of my very first ones.
Oh
I was probably reading those when I was 6.
yeah.
Um, started reading those then. But also younger childhood, around the same time I was reading like Boxcar Children and Nancy Drew and
Oh yeah.
uh, some of those mystery, like serial mysteries. Um, and then later I was into Sherlock Holmes. Um, but then like I kind of really spread out around the age of 12, and I was reading things like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters, um, Orson Scott Card. I've read all of the Ender's Game series and
Oh okay. Yeah.
about half of Bean's series. I haven't quite got through all of the Shadows ones. Um, yeah, kind of all over the board. I've also Chronicles of Narnia was another big one for me.
Ah yes yes.
Um, and then I also enjoy reading Louis L'Amour, a bunch
Ah.
of westerns.
Oh,
So
so
I'm
you
quite
you enjoy the sort of Wild West yeah. Okay, so that's
yeah
quite a broad spectrum of
yeah I have
genres.
quite the eclectic taste.
Yes, that's I mean that's certainly good. So, which would you say have influenced your writing most? Like,
Influence.
was well you mentioned C.S. Lewis's book, the books, The Chronicles of Narnia. You mentioned J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. So, what authors were sort of in the back of your mind when you were writing your books?
Um, as far as influencing my writing, has probably most been C.S. Lewis, Louis L'Amour, and Brandon Sanderson.
Oh
I've
yes, yes.
recently, recently as in the past 5 years, but gotten into all of Brandon Sanderson's works.
Right. So you sort of found a lot of fun and fantasy. So I mean, as a child, you mentioned that you would come up with plays and stories. So did you also have that experience where you would never finish the story, never finish the stories, or were you quite sophisticated in the way that you were able to finish them?
I don't think there was ever a story I wrote as a child I didn't finish.
Right.
I'm very much a finisher,
Okay.
so it kind of bothered me as I started getting into writing, and I just had projects. I'm like, I don't have the skill to do that right now. I'm gonna set this on the shelf for a little bit, and it's not finished, and I'm like, I need to finish that at some point.
Right. So you've got like a list of yeah. I'm the same. I've got a drawer full of things that will probably never see the light of day. Um, which is probably part of the writing process, isn't it?
It is, yeah. We've all got trunk novels, as I've heard them called.
Yes, yes. So how would you describe your process of writing? So, some people have rituals, some people have a way of doing it. Are you a pantser, a plotter? What are you? So just give us a little rundown of that.
Um, I'm uh, an out. I'm an outliner, but I leave myself a lot of room for spur of the moment. So I don't quite categorize myself as a plantser in between pantsing and outliner. Um, but I leave myself a lot of room for exploration in my outlines.
Right. So you're not going to stick to it religiously. You're going to maintain a sort of looseness to the thing, so that you're able to keep. Why is that actually? Why do you not stick to the outline religiously? Do you think?
Uh, because sometimes I find that where I was planning on going just isn't going to work.
Right.
Um, just so that I get to know my characters better. I'm like, yeah, no, they're not gonna have that happen. So we got to have something else happen to steer them that way. So they're generally still going the way I need them to, but maybe some of the things I'd originally outlined, I just gotta chuck and um,
And
find
that,
something else to do.
so I suppose that can be quite derailing, because we've seen with George R. R. Martin that he derailed himself so much so that he hasn't been able to finish the books. At least that's what I believe happened, because I think we've all had that where we were writing something, we let it go wherever it's going, and then suddenly you're like, oh, how do I finish this?
Yeah, so it was actually interesting in the my current manuscript that I'm working on right now. Actually, I just took out a big chunk and put two pieces closer together because I was gonna have like this whole other scene going on where some place was gonna be occupied, and then I just decided they don't have enough forces to do that, so we're actually gonna skip the whole occupation part and we're just going to cut to where the occupation was eventually going to lead because they were eventually going to get.
Right, so
Um,
you used your time machine of just the city was occupied, then well, obviously you put it in a much better way than that. But
Instead
then
of being occupied, they just came back and did what they were going to do after
right,
the
I see.
occupation got kicked out. So,
So for fantasy, we know that a lot of it is based on medieval European um, timing. So what is your sort of era like? Not sorry, let me rephrase that. What weaponry? What are this? Because you mentioned an army and occupation. So what kind of weaponry are we going to find in your books exactly?
so the one I currently have published, it's actually extremely tribal. So they
Ooh,
are mostly working with spears and bows and arrows. There is another civilization that has halberds and glaives,
right.
but as of right now, published, there hasn't been a single sword show up.
Oh, Jesus. So what was your sort of inspiration from, maybe from real life, that you drew from the tribal weaponry?
So I decided for NaNoWriMo, I needed to write a book, and I I was working on an outline for something, but I hadn't the way I was going about it. The outline was not going to be done anytime soon, so I was poking around on NaNoWriMo's website. They had a list of pictures, and one of them was whale bones. I think it was in Alaska, and they're just these huge. It was like a whale graveyard. All these
Yeah.
whale rib cages out of the ground. I'm like, you know what? What would happen if I made a world with dragon bones and dragon rib cages, and they made their tents out of that, and those were the frames. And I'm like, well,
Right.
what kind of society would
That
be living
classic
there? Like,
thing
well,
where you're looking at
probably.
a picture and then suddenly it's 12 at night. Yes. So okay, so you found inspiration in the in the remains of a whale.
Yes.
So I don't know why I put it that way, but I did. Um, so I suppose because there's obviously some. issues with when you add dragons to a world, because a lot of,
Yeah.
there's lots of things with like, well, if these dragons just show up and randomly destroy everything, how does that, how does the civilization interact with that? Because obviously we've had like natural disasters that can do similar things, but it seems to me like a dragon would be like the nuke of a medieval world. So, how have you dealt with dragons in your book? And obviously, don't give too much away so that people are forced, well, not forced. I know why I said forced, so that people come and read the books. Actually, you should. Can you give us the names of them so that we can?
Yeah. So the book I currently have out is Escape from Salmira,
Right.
and then the sequel is going to be called Gem Touched.
And are they on Amazon, or where can we find them?
Yes, they are on Amazon or will be on Amazon.
Right. Okay. Anyway, so how do your characters deal, or how does your civilization deal with dragons and the mythical creatures that may exist in the world?
The dragons are extinct.
Oh, that's a good start. Yeah.
So yeah, there was a major dragon war. They wiped themselves out, and they no longer exist. And
Oh
they
my God! They nuked themselves into.
they did.
I mean, that's an interesting way around it. So how do they? So how like give us like a bit of a timeline with how things are happening with the characters. Sorry.
So it's been 50 years since this dragon war happened,
Right.
and the the island that the people are on is just it's not fertile land anymore. Like there's grass that grows everywhere, but the food isn't growing and the animals are starting to die out
Right.
and they're struggling to find food. Um, and as they're trying to find food, then they end up getting lost in a cavern system and have to figure their way out.
So they sort of go underground to look for like what are they? Is there something that has driven them underground besides the?
So the what happens is they're in a cave collecting mushrooms and they fall down a shaft.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I see. And sorry, I was like for a second there, I was like, I can't think of much food that's underground. Do I bring that up? No. So okay. So So the fertile land is so. So why did they settle in a? Was it previously fertile and in the
It was
war?
previously fertile that they actually went underground and were living underground until the dragons died out, and then they came back on top, and they had been living there fine for the 50 years, and it's been gradually getting worse and
So it's sort
starting
of
to
like
fade.
I guess like an ice age sort of thing where we've now emerged from the caves and now we're like, it's time for domination. So, so did you? I may have brought that up, but did you maybe see that as a sort of parallel with the way we've sort of been treating our environment with the rapid changes in climate and things like that?
Um, there might be some slight similarities. There are other reasons that the land no longer is providing the food it needs.
Right.
That don't really come up till they'll briefly get mentioned in the second book, and it's going to come up a lot more in the third book.
You want to drag? Yes, yes. The idea of dragging that for as I mean, can we? Mm, yeah. So that's a little bit about the books. Is there anything you want to tell us about the D&D stuff you do?
So the D&D stuff is it's fun. A lot of what I've been doing with it is I um, I've been doing a bunch of seasonal storylines. So like my first storyline I ever put out was a Christmas module.
Oh,
Uh,
yeah.
And so like you have to go to the Arctic and you find this. He has a different name, but it's a Santa Claus imposter
Right.
who has been kidnapping people to make toys and. um,
Oh no.
so
Oh
that
dear.
was so then the players have to figure out what's going on and figure out how to get people back and but then I've made I'm not quite finished making them all. I have to finish up for the autumn series. But I've made a module for each month in winter, spring, and summer, as well
Right.
as a just like a general season module for
So,
each season.
what's your sort of, because there's lots of, as you mentioned, I think before we started, there's a lot of teaching in stories.
Yes.
So, moving back to your book, we'll come back to the D&Ds after this, but what stories are you what lessons are you trying to teach in these? Because obviously we brought up the idea of lack of food and resources. What is there something about not post scarcity that frightens you, or is there something you're trying to get across there?
Um, Maybe not so much scarcity. I have a love of being outdoors and learning how, like, what plants are edible um, and like what plants you can be used for medicinal purposes. More of what I find lessons in as I write or as I read is some of the emotional impact.
Right.
Like one of my characters, it's not spelled out, but she has anxiety, and so like she sometimes freezes up or things, or like takes a minute to make decisions, or um, she doesn't have high levels of anxiety, but I
But
want to make
there's
relatable characters that.
and if there's one thing that's relatable, uh, yeah. So okay, so you have sort of like a character who's not entirely sure of themselves. That
Yeah,
would be a fair assumption. And then so how does she, was it?
yeah.
Yes. How does she, like, how is she learning, like, is there something you learned? Did you have like a uncertainty about yourself that you then learn to overcome through some way, and then you're trying to transfix it onto the character? Is that how it happened, or?
A little bit, yeah. I see a lot of my anxieties in her, um, but like one of the things she does is she just finally decides, like, okay, you know what? This thing terrifies me, but I have to do it because I am the only one who can. And so she has to do something really hard and just does it. Other times, I think in the next book, I have like she like just takes a moment and pauses, and takes and does some deep breathing to calm herself down.
I see. So there's an element of what's that, mindfulness and grounding to try to
Yeah.
stop the flow of anxiety. And have you had, so you mentioned some anxieties, have you had problems with that at all?
Um, I have. I've had some issues with anxiety. Not like I've never been diagnosed or anything,
Right.
but I do get anxious. Like I get phone anxiety really bad.
Oh yes.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know
uh,
why. It seems to be in our well, I assume in our generation, it might be just my generation, that there seems to be this fear of being talking on the phone.
yeah, which is funny. Like jumping on here to like be doing a podcast. I haven't really had that, but like pick up like a phone receiver, and I'm like, nope, can't do it.
I still can't order pizza then. I Because I moved recently to a more rural area in New Zealand, and they don't do the online delivery sites, and I'm like,
Oh,
I don't want to have to. Yeah, and that's so okay. So you have sort of like a more yeah. So how would you um how would you say other art has influenced your writing?
Um,
So actually, I should narrow that down a bit more. Um, so I don't know why I asked such a broad question. Um, so you mentioned the whale bones, obviously, in on a website. I can't remember the name of that website, but what I mean, is there any other art that has sort of you've looked at it and gone, oh my god, that would make a great story? Like maybe I don't know. Have you been to some art museums or something like that?
um, there's nearby where I live. There's a museum, a couple museums of art. There's one at the university that um, is nearby, and um, there's a lot of religious art there at times, and at some point I want to write something a little bit more on of the religious nature, but some things that are more visual are like sometimes driving home. I live in the mountains.
Right.
Well, kind of. Um, there's on the freeway, the highway. I would often drive home, and driving over a point of the mountain, there would be the oftentimes the sun would be setting, and it would just the light would be like bright pink and purple and just hit the mountain in just a beautiful setting. I'm like, you know what? This is a scene that at some point I want to have in my writing. I haven't quite found places to put that in yet, but that's um,
Right, yeah, because I know in New Zealand we have a very a lot of our nature is quite unique as it is in Australia because we developed away from the rest of the world. So we have birds that are mainly made that developed colors for the sake of breeding and not really to hide from predators. So
mm,
a lot of the stuff I write can end up being quite fantastical in that way because there's no limitations in terms of that. So have you found like the environment you're in, like for animals, like do you have unique animals? Are they the standard animals like deer and things like that, or you said they were dying off? So are they domesticated? Are they what's the sort of idea there?
so in my book, they're all wild. They don't have any domesticated
Right.
animals. Um, but they are your standard. Like there's grouse and there's geese and um, they've got deer and elk. Um, they've got bears. Those can cause problems sometimes.
we, Jesus Christ. Actually, you can eat bear, can't you?
Yeah, you can eat bear or you can be eaten by bear. It goes both ways.
You can be eaten by a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, how? Yeah, I suppose that also brings up other questions. So, like for example, uh, are their societies affected heavily by well, do they even have a society if there's no? So, do they farm? Like, is there any domestication of anything? Because I mean, they've been underground they haven't been above ground for very long. So are they still in the developing stages of society of civilization?
Yeah, so they're very nomadic.
Right,
They move around. They try to leave plots of growing food so they it'll go to seed and replant itself.
right,
But that's the extent of their farming is they just kind of let it do its own thing.
right. So again, like you said, you're more. That's more of your interest in real life as being a bit more nomadic and how you do things in the wild and learning about nature rather than sort of like a Australian Aboriginal tribe. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I definitely got a lot of my inspiration of how things work based off of um, Aboriginal tribes and whether that was in Australia or like Papua New Guinea or the U.S. or um, some um, inspiration even came from like African tribes, but
Right.
well, but I mean, it's not like I don't know how to garden. I've had large gardens in my life. I just for this particular setting, they needed to be more nomadic.
Right, and so I suppose that brings its own challenges, right? With, like you said, with scarcity of food, and also with how if there's a bad hunt or a bad gathering season, you're all kind of screwed,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So there's that comes up in the book, obviously, right?
yes.
Okay,
Yeah, their stores are running low and they're finding less and less food and they're like,
is
what
there
are we gonna do? It's time to move again.
is their population growing?
um, no.
Okay, so the
I'd say it's probably shrinking a little bit. It's pretty stagnant, but if anything, it's probably shrinking.
do you,
They are still having kids, but they're not. It's
they're not
not.
extending from they're having like one or two, and then or they're having five and three of them die. Is that the sort of
Um, or they're having that many, and then the adults are dying. Is more what's going
right?
on.
Okay, so there's not really much of a replacement. Okay, because
Yeah.
obviously, if you have no food, you're not going to want to bring. Well, you can't bring children into the world because you can't. You need to be able to
Right.
nourish the mother. So is is there any sort of have you done anything on anthropology to learn about how societies have coped with lack of food? Because obviously there's been quite a few famines, but those have been in countries in societies that have farming and rely on domesticated animals. So has there been any sort of because it sounds like very much like an apocalyptic event where the food is starting to dry up and that could be quite dangerous for them. Is there
Yeah,
anything you've done there?
I haven't done a lot of research into it because it's become so recent of a problem that like so they still have like especially like older primary age children uh, and then like teens um, but it's become so like they knew they had to be careful with their resources but the resources are becoming more scarce and they're still trying to figure out what to do with it.
Right. Okay. So there's sort of like a okay, so it's starting to creep up on them, and they're starting to. So tell
Yeah,
me a bit
yeah.
about this cabin system. Is there sort of a? Is there any sort of? Because obviously they were underground for a very long time. So is there sort of the remains of anything? Is it like a dwarven kingdom, like from Lord of the Rings, or is it just like a natural occurring thing?
It was more of a natural occurring thing. There is a civilization down there, but the humans don't know about it.
Oh dear. Nothing underground tends to be pleasant.
So yes, they when they're underground, they discover a new civilization they had no idea about, and um, while they're down there, they discover magic that the civilization has, which then leads into the second book. But um,
I see. So talking about a bit more about the arts that are around you. So TV, was there much TV watching as a child, or were you mainly inspired by books?
I
Or,
was mostly inspired by books. I did watch some TV, but it was like police procedurals is what I was watching as a
sorry?
kid. Um, um, at least that's what I would watch prime time. Otherwise, I was just watching like the kids shows on um, PBS or public broadcasting system.
Right,
Um, Nowadays, I would watch more movies as a kid,
right.
and now that I'm an author and do long form writing, like uh, movies almost drive me up the wall because the storytelling is so condensed, and I'm like, wait, I want to explore that a little bit more. And
Right.
so I've been getting back into TV shows like the new Disney Plus um, series like Mandalorian or
Oh, yes.
Loki or two that I've really enjoyed, and
Have
how
you
much
have you
it
seen
can.
Kenobi?
Yes. Oh, there are parts of Kenobi that I liked and parts that I didn't, but
Well, I mean, we've got time, so let's talk a bit about Kenobi because we've covered
okay.
it. We've covered it on the podcast before. I'm interested in how you reacted. Have you seen Rebels?
I've not.
Okay, so I because two of us in the that have regularly hosted this, two of us have seen Rebels, so we knew that the Grand Inquisitor survived. But how did you react to when he sort of just showed up out of in the final episode, just sort of like, or in the no, the second to the last episode, and sort of was like, hey, guess what?
I'd had it spoiled for me. Like I had seen something on
Ah,
social media before I'd watched it, and
ah.
I had a sneaking suspicion he was coming back. But yeah, it was kind of like, okay, that's kind of out of the blue. Like how, what, huh?
Oh, so does that? Have you seen the Clone Wars?
I haven't seen any of the animated
Okay,
series.
cool. So do you know that Darth Maul lives?
Yes, I do know that.
Okay, because I mean, which do you think was harder to believe? The fact that the guy that got sliced in half survived, or the guy that got stabbed in the stomach survived? Or the guy that had all his limbs cut off and set on fire survived?
um, I mean, it probably is harder to believe that Darth Maul survived, but like the way it was presented in Kenobi was like, okay, well, yeah, he's dead now, and I don't know.
What
It just,
I personally love, if you don't know the Maul, how Maul comes back, but essentially they find him on like a planet filled with rubbish, and
oh,
he's made spider legs for himself. He's just like held together by the force, and you're like, what? Because this is, you have to remember, this movie, these cartoons were coming out when I was like 13, and they were meant for my age, and there were things like that, just Maul completely insane with giant spider legs just crawling
I
around.
remember like my siblings were watching it at one point, and I just like hopped in a couple times. It's like, what? Darth Maul's alive, and he has spider legs. Okay.
Darth Maul's a lot, and he's oh dear.
I like, I guess that makes sense, but okay.
So, were you much of a Star Wars fan when you were younger, or now even?
Yeah, I'd say I've grown up as a Star Wars fan. Like, I wouldn't call myself a super fan, but I've been a fan.
Right. And what were your
Uh,
opinions of the sequel?
so I like the sequel series, so like Force Awakens and
Yeah, yeah,
um I was fine with Force Awakens. After that, I was kind of like, hey, what are you doing here?
yeah. Where's this going? And then
Like,
you
okay,
found out it's not going anywhere.
yeah, especially when you change writers in the middle and
Oh, oh, that was a weird choice. I
like
did.
your parents are nobody.
Your
Okay, your parents are the children of Palpatine.
parents are nobody, but your granddad.
Yeah.
Your granddad was the
Uh,
emperor of the galaxy, but somehow his children got away.
yeah.
Do you know what I
Uh,
was? I recently got. You'll see the guy in the Discord channel that's called Gambling Man. Him and I have been playing the Skywalker Saga Lego thing because we both grew up with the Lego Star Wars games, and we begrudgingly played the sequels because we want the 100% completion. But we got that. I forgot about that scene completely. But when he just says somehow Palpatine returned, that gives me confidence as a writer. Does it to you as well that someone can write that, have it put in a major movie, and not get fired
Yeah,
or told no?
yeah. Like it is encouraging to me when like I read authors that I love and like have made it big time, and I'm like, oh, you did that? Okay.
Stephen
Like,
Stephen King did cocaine. Ah, okay. Note to self:
uh,
do cocaine.
yeah, I mean, I know it's gonna be harder for me as a new author,
Yeah.
but
Actually, yeah.
um,
Let's talk. So, were you self-published, traditionally published? How did you publish?
I'm self-published, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Um, so I did for the first book, I did have beta readers and used a lot of their feedback, and um, I did a lot of editing. I went through 4 drafts before I got to the final draft
Right.
on the
Yeah.
book. Um, this next book, I'm part of a writing group now, and so I've been having a lot more detailed critique, which has been super helpful. And I feel like I've grown a lot as an author.
Right. And so you're sort of running your own business with that because obviously
Yeah.
obviously you're having to do everything that a publishing house would normally do. So
Yes.
have you found like what are the challenges you found in self-publishing and what are some of the benefits you found in self-publishing?
Um, Biggest challenge I've found in self-publishing is it is really hard to get your name and your book out there. Um, pretty, Pretty much like you're gonna have your social media that you're putting stuff out on. Um, you can advertise on Amazon, but it
Costs a
I
lot of
haven't.
money.
Yeah, it's not the cheapest thing to do. Um,
I was like,
it
just a little behind the scenes. I was thinking, oh, I'll advertise the podcast on Spotify. Minimum $10,000. No, no, never mind.
yeah. So marketing is um, one of those things that um, is hard to do because you don't have anybody helping you out on it. And I really botched my opportunity to have a good launch for my book, and so it's been out almost 2 years. But I, it's made sales. Everyone I've talked to has enjoyed it, and but it's just been really hard to get out there.
Break the, what do you call it? The brick wall that is being anonymous online.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm definitely looking at things I can do better to launch this next book better, and um, I'm working on another series that I'm looking at getting traditionally published, but I
Right.
gotta finish writing it first. And the way the series is gonna go, I want to have the whole series done before I even approach a publishing house. So
Right, so you have lots to present. So you're keeping yourself busy at least. So, what are some. So, besides being completely unknown before when you publish, is there like have you gone through line editing and things like that and paid the like how did you budget for the I suppose is what I'm asking. How did you budget for all the costs and things like that? Is there do you have some business background or did you just go in pretty blind?
um, I have some business background. My mom was great about teaching me about that growing up. She graduated in finance.
Right.
And like my family's been entrepreneurs all growing up, so business wasn't something I was
Foreign
unfamiliar
to you.
with. Yeah, so actually, a lot of my startup costs came, or like startup money came from my Dungeons and Dragons stuff because I was just splitting royalties with the person who was doing my design. I teamed up with a friend; we were
Right.
just splitting royalties. And so I had no startup costs for that. And so anything I was making, I was putting into making my book better.
Right. And so with Dungeons and Dragons, how do you sort of get in? I've never thought about that before, but how do you sort of get into that selling your what did you call it again? Sorry, I'm not very familiar with D&D.
Yeah. They're called modules when they're short stories that you can just
Right.
insert. into a campaign is the larger story.
Yeah.
Um,
So how do you sort of sell those? I'm not
so
asking
with
because I'm going to do it, but I swear. I swear.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Wizards of the Coast actually has a website that they team up with. It's called DM's Guild.
Cool.
Um, and that's the official place to publish things, and you don't have to worry about licensing because it's officially endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. Um, and they provide clip art, so you can um, you can put pictures into anything you're putting out on there without having to buy it or anything.
Right.
You can buy it too, but they have resources for you, so you don't have to.
And would you say that was easier or harder than what you're doing right now with your book?
It's different because with the book, I'm just telling the story and I'm showing emotions of different things. With the modules, the Dungeons and Dragons modules, you have to. It's a lot more technical. So fortunately, I already had some experience in technical writing too. But um,
Everything just falling into place, yeah.
yeah, it's a combination of storytelling and technical writing because you've got to make sure like monsters you're throwing at the level that you're creating it for aren't going to just like wipe them out in 2 blows, or 1 blow in some cases.
Yeah.
But you've also got to have the story aspect, so you've got to find the monsters that are low enough level that your characters can actually fight and win, but are actually going to be a challenge for them. And then find different little puzzles to create, or say, hey, they should be making this type of check, trying to do this type of thing at this point. This is how hard it is for them to do. It's just a very different type of writing. I enjoy both of them, but they're very different from one another.
Right, and which pays better, I suppose, is a question that's on any writer's mind, especially mine.
Right now, it's the D&D stuff.
Right, so that's a decent sort of flow, or is it because you did well with how you wrote it?
I every time I put something out there, it ends up on the front page, so people see it, they'll buy the new thing, and oftentimes people will also see they also when you go into an item, it shows you what else has been written by that author, and so
Right.
they'll see the other stuff I've put out, and
Okay,
so the
so
more I
that's
put out, the more often I put something out, the more money I make, which is why it's doing better because with the book I can only put so many of those out and quick so fast and
well, you give me a great idea. I don't know much about D&D, but I can learn. Okay, so and then so movies. So we were talking about that briefly, but movies. So what movies inspired you, or what movies have? Obviously, we talked about Star Wars. We said about Narnia, the Chronicles of Narnia, not the Narnicles of Chronica. I don't know where that came from, but yeah. So, what movies have inspired you?
Lord of the Rings is definitely a big one.
Yeah.
I I grew up with the extended edition of Lord of the Rings. So.
Oh, God.
um, so let's see, what other movies? I grew up on Disney, so a lot of the classic Disney, and then
Aladdin, Lion King.
yeah,
Is
Lion
Shrek
King.
Pixar? I think Shrek's Pixar.
Shrek is DreamWorks.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Um,
I got confused.
yeah, I'm not sure I'd call. I'm not sure I'd call Shrek an inspiration, but it was one that I
It's
watched as a kid.
you
I
know,
mean, maybe because I have thought of doing compilations of like, well, what happens if we throw a whole bunch of people from a bunch of different stories in one story?
what are the Star
Like
Wars
that way.
people? Disney already saying no.
Um.
Yeah, what if we made a holiday special in Star Wars?
Oh no.
It's Chewbacca's family.
Oh, I could not make it through 10, 15 minutes of that.
There's a moment in the movie where there's this woman doing a cooking thing. I don't know what the context is, and it's just her saying stir, whip, whip, stir." And I found a 10-hour version and played it on one of the Discord bots while we were playing a game of Civilization. So yeah, it's certainly the gift that keeps on giving. Which also brings me to video games, actually. Do you? I assume because you have Discord, you have some sort of game in your.
Actually, I use Discord for just connecting with people. um,
How
I'm
dare
not much of
you?
a gamer. Um, I used to play things like StarCraft,
Mm,
um,
yeah.
but I kind of gave up on gaming. Besides like tabletop,
Oh, yeah.
um, I did used to. What did I used to play? It was mostly like StarCraft and Age of Empires, so it was more like the strategy, like big
Yeah.
army.
Real time
Which
strategies, though, so you're not as good as us.
but it also that actually has been an inspiration because seeing like all the armies together, I'm like, okay, I know how I need to form this army, and so it hasn't come in so much in the current series I have published, but in the other series I'm working on, it's a war epic, and so uh, I can see like, okay, so the army needs to be over here, and then another army over here, and
So you've learned
uh,
positioning from Age of
yeah,
Empires.
yeah.
I'm just thinking about because me and the other host Jag have played that Age of Empires 3 for a little while, and yeah, I mean he certainly knew how to kick my butt every time. I'd play the Russians and try to overrun him with Cossacks, but it turns out Cossacks aren't that good. Especially not in my uncapable hands. But in Civilization, which I'm sure you've heard of, the grand strategy. Yeah, I'm
Yeah, I've played Age of Empires 3. I am much more familiar with
too.
Age of Empires 2. But I probably most of my strategy that I know how to play best is actually in StarCraft playing Protoss.
Uh,
So
right. Don't play
like
much.
just get me a bunch of carriers.
Just overwhelm them with fire.
Yes.
So, also, I was just wondering about that. Is history wise, has there been any particular history? I know that in America, you guys have like a very good, well, not sorry, have a very domestic centric focus. Very technical way of saying you guys focus more on national history than international history, right?
Yeah. My dad was a World War II buff as I was growing up, and so um, I've heard, like I know I don't know as much about it as he does, but I'm familiar with like the in general the sea battles in the Pacific and the like landing on Normandy Beach.
Oh, so the
Um,
Western sort of like the
but probably the era, time of history I'm most familiar with is the American Revolution.
right.
Uh, Actually, every year I'm part of a colonial village. It's the largest colonial village west of the Mississippi, and
Yeah.
um, so every year I'm helping. Like I'm there. I'm learning, but I'm also like part of the apothecary tent. I also help with the coopering and the broom making. I've learned about chandlery and spoon making and blacksmithing and tanning, um, which is all super applicable in almost any fantasy setting.
Right. Yeah, because you aren't just going to have a factory make it in Dubai. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Eventually, I do have a historical fiction I have slowly brewing, which will be involving a Chandler, which will be fun. Um,
I
but
know
like,
I know the favorite of every World War Two because I'm a World War Two buff too, but
okay,
more on the Eastern Front than anything. So
yeah.
I know.
Well, and
Hmm?
go ahead. Sorry.
No, so I know that in the historical groups, the favorite thing for them to write is I don't know why it is, and it's a I'm not gonna lie, it's someone who is an ethnic minority that the Nazis would have killed. Um, it is sort of a bit disconcerting when they have like what if Hitler won, and it's a little creepy, but that is the one that everyone writes. The sort of um, man in the high no man in the high castle, I think something like that. The sort of
Mhm.
the era of what if the Nazis won. So yeah, what were you saying anyway?
Yeah. So I have kind of a unique perspective on World War II because one of my great grandfathers was a beach master. Another great grandfather didn't serve in the war. I'm still not entirely sure why, but he didn't serve. One of them got drummed out of the army, and the other one served in the Lithuanian army for the Germans.
Oh, he was a
And
hill figure. Hill, yeah, I know. I used to know the name.
I don't know what term would have been used other than he was in the Lithuanian army. But he, like, that side of my family is from Eastern Germany, Ostpreußen.
Oh yeah,
And
Osprey, yeah.
and so I have like most of the war stories I know. Like one of my dad's uncles like was actually at Pearl Harbor when it was bombed.
Oh,
Uh, yeah, his barracks was the first one to be hit, but they happened to tick off their commanding officer and were on a hike that morning and didn't get blown up.
oh,
Um, um, but so like my great grandpa on the German side has all these crazy war stories. Like he was executed by the Russians but lived to tell about it.
yeah. A surprising number of people. I'm not saying that. You know, it's weird how some people survive. It's Hilfsweigel or Hiwis were the names of the Nazi collaborators in Eastern Europe, but it sounds like he was from either Memel or just Ostpreußen itself. Um, was so. I mean, that certainly is interesting. So you have both sides. Well, yeah, both sides
Yeah.
of the war on you in you. Is there sort of a I suppose that must be so. The war stories you get are probably both from would be from an anti-Soviet perspective because well, American for one, and then Lithuanian for another. So
Yeah.
how do you how did you how did you because my girlfriend's German, she knows that the she sort of came to some sort of they come to a conclusion very young in Germany that they were in the wrong. How did your family sort of teach you about your Lithuanian side?
Um. So my great grandpa immigrated to the U.S. in the 50s with my grandma and her sister and their mom. Um. So um they've been in America my whole life.
Right.
And so as I learned more about why he was in the war and what they were doing, he was not a Nazi sympathizer at all. He was just serving his country.
Right.
Um, and they they were more afraid of the Russians. Like they were evacuating as the Russians were chasing them out of their home, and they were crossing the ice in the dead of the night and hearing the horses fall through the ice. And um, like the more I think about what my even just my grandma has gone through, I'm like, oh my goodness, like these are crazy stories. Um,
Yes. So the
but it was a lot of, well, yeah, maybe the like my My great grandpa punched Eric Koch in the face. Um, so like he
It's
they were
yeah, that's
we
certainly.
think we figured the only way he survived that is he knocked him clean cold and ran away. um,
Okay. We have a World War II hero, ladies and gentlemen.
yeah, like my great grandpa's stories are crazy.
Oh, I
Um,
wish Jag was here because his grandfather was in England during the war, and he tells this great story about how because his grandfather was a draft dodger, and so he was a sort of traveling salesman who would go from town to town selling stuff, and then whenever the draft board caught up with him, he would move, right? So, but eventually they caught up with him, and he was told to join something. So he said, "I'll join the navy," and he got his engineering degree in 1945. Now, if you're a history buff, you may know that year has some significance. So, by the time they caught up with him, the war was over, and he never saw combat. And I think that's inspired Jag to be one of the most shifty sort of when it comes to work. He very much does what not the bare minimum, but sort of he plays with the rules a lot, and he does that in games as well
mm.
because he's a bastard. Yeah. Um. Anyway, anyway. A little bit of anger from the last time we played CS:GO, and he agreed to a knife fight and shot me in the face. Um. Yeah. So okay. So we'll just wrap up here. But any final tips for aspiring writers like myself or that guy over there? Yeah, like any sort of tips for how you would come up when you're writing or anything like that.
Best tip I have is just keep working on it. Like, it, your first draft isn't necessarily going to be pretty. Like, some people's are nicer than others, but a lot of them, like, you're going to throw out 3/4 of what you wrote. So just keep at it. Don't judge yourself too harshly. That's what revision is for.
That's when you judge yourself too harshly.
No, even then, it's just like, okay, no, I can see how this can be cleaned up, and then you go over another revision pass, and you're like, oh, I can see how this can be cleaned up, and
Oh, this is terrible. Oh, this is really bad. Oh no.
no, that's one of the things is you don't necessarily have to think that way. It's just like, oh no, this could be cleaned up a little bit. This could be better. Um, just be kind to yourself as you're writing.
Right, be kind to yourself. Yeah. Okay. Well, again, would you like to give your book titles again, just so and also spell out the final word in the first one because I'm
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
need that for linking.
So the first book is called Escape from Salmira, and Salmira is spelled Salmira. And then the sequel, which will be coming out around the turn of the year, I don't have a release date yet, but it'll be around the turn of the year between 2022 and 2023. That one will be Gem Touched, all
Excellent.
one word.
And anything else from D&D that you want to?
From D&D, if you look me up on DM's Guild, it'll be under Rebecca Fincher. Um, the Christmas one is called The Solstice Imposter.
And any social media that you want to advertise them?
Right now, I'm mostly on Facebook, so you can find me there under Rebecca Illette Fincher. Illette is Ellette.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for joining me, not us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All good. And also remember to check out Tremaine's Sci-Fi Hour, the Facebook page and the Instagram page to to find out when we upload, and also to see me occasionally complain about Disney merchandise. That T-shirt really shouldn't have fallen apart for $30, but yeah. So and also remember to check back here every Tuesday at 7 a.m. New Zealand time for more episodes. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.